Dear Dr. Sabet, thank you for joining me again. This is the second session we are having together. The first one was on the topic of the social sciences. Today I want to continue with a related theme. Could you please explain to us the developmental model of religion you have outlined in your work? I really would like you to take your time in describing the model. I also have a diagram of it here, which I will share with everyone. Yeah, here it is. So yeah, please feel free to take it over.
Sure. Thank you again for inviting me for this second interview. I hope I can say something valuable about these important topics. The first item is about the evolutionary or developmental processes that, according to the Bahá'í Faith and Bahá'í theology, is the backbone or the organizing principle of Bahá'í teachings. And that is the idea of unfolding truth, that God sends messengers to this world and messages that are suited for human capacity and the historical necessity and geographical condition. All of these situations or environment are aspects of these progressive divine revelations. So I think the foundation of this idea is that, philosophically speaking, Bahá'í Faith acknowledges change. Nothing is static in this world. Everything is in the process of becoming and changing and evolving, or reaching a degree of kamal or perfection. So in that sense, religion also is a part of this evolving process. Alfred North Whitehead, American English professor and mathematician, once said that religion commits suicide if it doesn't change and evolve like science. And this is very relevant to Baha'i thinking as well. So therefore, there are two aspects that I have to mention here. Is about the universal aspect of religion, which is, everlasting, and they are renewed in every religious dispensations. And then there are particular situations depending on the culture and progress of humanity in terms of social development, technological development, and so on. And so that is the social principles that change and evolve. So there is a interesting relationship between the spiritual, universal, everlasting principles of religions that constitute the concept of unity of all religions, because they are all coming from the same source with the same divine purpose in order to elevate human condition, in order to create a new consciousness of spirituality and to create moral rectitude and so on. In other words, the element of transcendental that reminds humanity that we do not belong to this earth. Our true sense, true essence is something spiritual that wants to achieve perfection, to progress, to separate ourselves from mundane aspects of life and seek higher aspects of knowledge and experience and development. So, and these two really work together. Another important thing that we should mention about this idea of evolving religious traditions is that it rejects two things that in traditional religions are somehow emphasized. One is that the finality of dispensation or revelation, and the other one is the exclusivity of religious dispensation. Many religions, almost most of them, particularly when it becomes a part of the sociocultural or institutions of religion, when they are somehow separated from the original spiritual impulse and revelation and become a part of history, basically become like another ideology. So the idea one is the idea of finality, that they claim that the revelation has ended and they are the final religion, the final answer, and therefore there is no need for any new divine revelation. Maybe reform of some sort is acceptable, but within the parameters of the initial revelation, not as a completely new revelation. So that is one. And the other one is the concept of exclusivity, that they believe their revelation is somehow unique and separated from other religious traditions, and perhaps better, in a sense that they provide a wider aspect of truth to humanity. These two concepts are rejected in Baha'i thinking when we talk about religions and the role of religions. We believe that religious dispensations come and grow through a process of evolution, and then there is the idea of cyclical renewal, when the initial spiritual sentiment of religion phase out, and the need for a new revelation comes about. And so that is basically the idea, that there is no final religion, there is no final prophet or messenger of God. This is a continuous process. This is an evolving process, because human, if religions come to save humanity spiritually, humanity is in a state of dynamic evolution, and therefore that dynamism that we assume for human civilization must be also assumed for religious dispensations and revelations. The other one is, as I said, the concept of exclusivity, that they have the truth, they have the answer. I can say, as an example, the finality is about the notion of finality of religion, particularly in Islamic tradition, that is very highly emphasized, and that is one of the mafhum khatamiyat, that is the prophet was the end of all prophets, and after him there is no other. I mean, he basically brought everything that humanity needed forever. And that really, in my view, is a rejection of change, science, progress, and everything, because no revelation can bring, I mean, of course, the spiritual side of it, we said, is okay. But as I said, there is a dynamic relationship between the spiritual principles and social principles and historical necessities. And therefore, if they do not work with each other, it creates a tension, a chaos. And so that is an exclusivity, perhaps, can be related to Christian belief that Jesus Christ was like really the essence of history. He was the only person who brought humanity offered humanity through his blood, through his sacrifice, a chance for redemption. And it goes back to the idea of original sin, that human beings were cursed from the beginning, and then they were thrown out of the heaven, and they are carrying this original sin from generation to generation, and that includes followers of all religions and even prophets of God, such as Moses, prophets of the Abrahamic prophets, and so on. The only perfect human being was infallible was Jesus Christ, and in fact, he was. Then it takes us to the concept of Trinity, and Jesus Christ as being at the same time the Holy Ghost and God, and so on, which is really beyond our discussion. But basically, the whole idea is that Jesus Christ brought the only answer, and salvation exclusively, human salvation, depends on believing in Jesus Christ and acknowledging him, that he came and he shed his blood for our sin, and now we have to repent and go to him and ask for salvation. So, but this is not a part of this Baha'i picture. The two concepts of finality and exclusivity. The other feature of Baha'i thinking is Baha'i theology. I think ultimately the purpose of religion or any new revelation is to create a new civilization. So there is a very, very dynamic, progressive, unique sense of relationship between the concept of revelation and the establishment of civilization. That religions come to go along with human progress and inject a dose of spirituality into social progress, technological progress, scientific progress, and create a cohesive spiritual, social, technological, scientific environment for an emerging civilization. And this is, of course, another topic for scientists, for historians, for social scientists, sociologists to really examine how there is an element of spirituality and moral rectitude and moral codes behind every major civilizations of the world. So this is strongly emphasized in the Baha'i teachings. And in fact, the claim is that the revelation of Baha'u'lláh will eventually lead to a global civilization. So that is basically one part of this discussion. The other one is about the diagram that you brought up, that I can explain it a little bit more. Yes. As you see, there are 3 stages in this model. The first stage, which are some concentric circles within each other, but separated from each other. But within, this first item or first level of religious formation is, the idea is that a religion comes into being it's the smallest circle in the first one is the nucleus of a new revelation. And this nucleus is within a broader cultural, social environment, and then that also is within again a much broader social, cultural, scientific environment or philosophical environment. But they are not communicating with each other. There is an element that the broader, the outside, the bigger circle represents the dominant mode of thinking and behavior and values. And then, of course, then there is the circle in between, which is about the neighboring dominant ideas. And then, of course, in the middle is the nucleus of the new religion. Now, for instance, in the Bahá'í Faith, we can say that the nucleus was when the Bab declared his mission to Mullah Hussein in 1844. And that was the beginning of this nucleus. And of course, there were some historical and theological background behind it. I don't want to discuss that. So a new religion was formed. And this revelation became a part of history on that particular night when the revelation was conveyed from the source of revelation to another human being, to the brain and consciousness of another human being. And then he went out and brought the letters of living, and then gradually the whole country became aware of this new revelation. So this is how religion starts, with the initial impulse at a particular moment in history, and then it grows and expands and becomes a part of the social interactions and social progress and so on. During that particular period of infancy of religion, or when it is just a nucleus, there are certain conditions that apply to that situation. And this model can be applied, roughly speaking, to most religious traditions. It's almost like a common sense. And of course, there are differences in terms of a specific religion, a specific cultural environment, a specific historical period, and so on. But a general pattern, a historical trajectory, basically, can be constructed based on this model. So during that particular period of infancy, religion has its own characteristics. It is limited. The number of believers are limited. Historically, there has been periods of severe persecution and sacrifices of the early believers. And the main point of this era is, or this period, or this stage, is to consolidate the faith, consolidate the teaching, and expand it so it can grow and get more strength in order to advance itself and expand its boundaries. During this period, as I said, the knowledge, in terms of the knowledge available to the believers, is very basic. It's just the words of prophet. Or, for instance, in the what Jesus Christ preached to his followers when he was living before his martyrdom, and then these believers told each other about what he said, and what and that became the foundation of the new Bible, or yes, the Christian Bible. So, and then, of course, as I said, the knowledge is very limited. And perhaps I could say people's understanding of the ultimate vision of religion is still limited too. They know they have found the truth, but it is difficult to really perceive where this new revelation is going and how it can expand and what would be the end result of this, which is natural. Again, it's a limited intellectual environment, and it must grow in terms of history and exchange of ideas. So this is the characteristics of this embryonic inception of a new religion and its gradual evolution. And again, when you go to different religions, for instance, in Islam, in the early days, it was the main sources of knowledge were perhaps Quran, which to some extent, and then what the Prophet said, or Sunnah, or Hadith, and so on. And then almost it took 2 centuries that we saw somehow expansion of this knowledge, better understanding of this when Islam expanded itself, became like almost an empire, and then established a social political foundation, and then gradually we see cultural exchanges took place, and the early study, if it was in a madrasa or a school of Christianity, which was a part of masjid or the place of worship, was Quran and that, but gradually it became other subject matters came into the picture, like astronomy, philosophy, math, and so on. And again, it was because of exchanges with other cultures, like works of Greek philosophy were translated into Arabic, and then Iranian and Persian culture strongly influenced the formation of, or actually operation of, Islamic empire under Bani Abbas and so on. So because of these interactions, this religion became more sophisticated, and then gradually we see that the concept of a school was separated from the concept of the place of worship. They became their own institutions. Same thing almost happens in Christianity, that the Christianity for, I don't know, 400 years was perhaps in this period of embryonic inception and growth and persecution and sacrifices and so on. But gradually, when it became by Constantine a major religion in Rome, and then it started to grow, and then we see that how basic book of Old Testament and New Testament came together, and that became the foundation of major philosophical scientific progress. Saint Augustine, Thomas Aquinas, and many others incorporated Greek philosophy with Christian theology and established very sophisticated form of theological doctrine. And the point is, they gradually move towards establishing civilization. By that, I mean, of course, there were some negative aspects in this process in terms of wars, in terms of the tyranny of some of the leaders who claim the leadership of these religions and so on. But overall, a pattern can be, a general pattern can be observed, that the sphere of influence of these religions became stronger. They established universities, schools, hospitals. They became sources of philanthropic deeds that still continues, up to this date. So that is the first diagram. And the second one is when it shows when the initial religion, the nucleus, that embryonic infancy is growing and coming closer and closer to the dominant mode of thinking, to the paradigm of thinking of their time, thinking, feeling, and acting, and so on. And the third one is when this internal development of this nucleus grows to the point that it becoming the dominant or paradigm, or incorporates the dominant paradigm into itself and becomes the ultimate paradigm. It is the stage that sometimes we can say it's the stage of when a religion from a stage of infancy reaches to the stage of establishing a civilization. So I think this is one way of understanding this process of development, and how in the beginning small persecuted community but spiritually motivated start to advance and move from the state of infancy to later on, centuries later, to establishing a civilization. And of course, in the process, there has been all sorts of ups and downs, progress and regress, persecution and sacrifice, and so on. So this is basically one thing that we can briefly discuss about this aspect of religion and its development. It has other features. I have tried to describe it in some articles in more details, but this is one way of briefly discussing it. And it, as I said, we can develop many more ideas about this. For instance, the type of scholarship that develops during the first and second and the third stage. The type of philosophical frameworks that they develop. For instance, in the first stage, all we see is just perhaps a basic attempt to understand the words of God at the basic level. And then perhaps creating a compilation of the words of God and spreading it around. And then gradually, after that, perhaps because, as I said, this is also a pattern in religion that older religions have persecuted the older, the new ones, the new ideas, the new revelation that took place in let's say, clear example is the case of Christianity and the case of the Bahá'í Faith. So another attempt at a scholarship is basically trying to defend the faith against accusations, attacks, through writing, through articles that explain the real vision and try to refute the attacks and accusations and persecution through the work of a scholarship. And then gradually you see the nature of this scholarship evolves and changes. It goes from now, when religion becomes a little bit more sophisticated, we see that now articles are produced that go beyond just defending the faith or apologetics and trying to relate and provide answer to social issues and social changes and respond to theories and philosophies that are dominant in the culture, critique some, approve some, so on. And this pattern grows and grows. And so at one point, we can see that it almost becomes like at certain period of time, this dominant worldview becomes the dominant worldview of the emerging civilization.
That was a brilliant, brilliant introduction into this. Thank you so much. Do you want to? I feel like I could ask two different questions here. One would be,
sure.
Maybe the right question would be, well, let's see. The first question I could ask would be, what are the advantages or what are the dangers and opportunities of each of these phases? That could be one question. Or the other question could be to talk about the role of philosophy in all of this and how exactly does the nucleus of new knowledge interact with the knowledge in the outer environment, and what is the role of philosophy in that? Maybe we can start with the second one, and then we can return to the stages later on, because I have more questions about that as well at the end.
Okay, wonderful. So in terms of philosophy, it's a really extraordinary topic, and in other words, philosophy of religion. And so today I thought it's maybe I can focus on what I understand about key provisions of a Bahá'í philosophy. And so based on that, I can say that the first thing that comes to my mind, which I learned from the first time that I was studying this topic, heard from a Bahá'í scholar in Iran, Dr. Dawoodi, who said that at this point, perhaps we don't have a fully developed Bahá'í philosophy. And I think it's very important to mention that first, because this is a time, again, going back to the three stages that I explained. Perhaps at that time in Iran, maybe this has a bit changed now. Only history can come back and say how this trajectory has worked. But perhaps at that time, the idea was that instead of, according to his expression, when there are times in religion when people stand up to advance the faith, to be persecuted and courageously defend the faith. And then he said, after that, there is a time for people to sit and think and reflect on philosophy. And he said, at that time, the trajectory of the Bahá'í faith was really a time for standing up and defend the faith and consolidate. So based on that, I can say my understanding is that the Bahá'í faith seems to me does not possess an explicit systematic philosophy because of this youthful nature and this evolving nature. And by that, I mean systematic philosophy. The concept of systematic theology is a huge topic in all religious traditions. There have been volumes of book written just on let's say, Christian systematic theology and so on, thousands of pages. But that's after 2,000 years of work. But so therefore, we need give time to the evolution of Baha'i philosophy. And therefore, philosophy typically emerges in religions after those developmental stages. So that is the idea. But we have to be we have to mention something here, and that is, it doesn't mean we shouldn't think about Baha'i philosophy at this point. Of course, we should, but acknowledge the limitations that we may have. So therefore, we don't have to wait for the golden age of the faith, when the faith becomes a global civilization, in order to sit down and be reflective and think about philosophical inquiry. So having said that, I think one aspect of Baha'i philosophy is about this, as I briefly mentioned, that about the outer expression of divine reality, which is dynamic, vital, and progressive. That is like really the skeleton of Baha'i thinking, and therefore it must be reflected in this philosophical outlook. That religion must remain alive and relevant to society, to social progress. Perhaps if we discuss social theories, we can discuss that further. So, and in order to avoid stagnation. The other part of this philosophy is that emphasizing that religion provides a divine philosophy. This is I'm taken from Baha'i literature, centered on oneness, love, unity, and then of course it must expand and grow with the emergence of history and historical development. Excuse me. Another aspect of Baha'i philosophy, in my limited knowledge, is that Baha'i philosophical thinking must be after the process of integrating knowledge, bringing different facets of knowledge together. In other words, emphasizing the convergence of religion, philosophy, and science into a coherent framework. I think another feature of course, these must be, developed in the future. Each one of these topics could be the subject of many books and articles and discourse. How convergence of religion, philosophy, and science within the Baha'i dispensation could take place. Another aspect of Baha'i philosophy goes back to one of the Baha'i principles, that is independent investigation of truth. That means we have to explore all realms of knowledge and philosophy, and that leads us to bringing religion and science together. In other words, philosophy must establish that connecting factor between philosophical thinking, universalization of human ideas, and the actual discoveries and scientific data and scientific developments. So philosophy, religion, and science must come together. In other words, this is, of course, one of the teachings of the Baha'i faith, harmony of science and religion. But I think in this process, philosophy plays a major role. It's not that science is this side and religion is that side, and without the role of philosophy, we can bring them together. It is impossible, because almost for, I don't know, for centuries, science was a part of philosophy, and still philosophy provides some universal feedback to scientists when scientific theories fail. A philosophical framework could lead scientists to further experimentation, to further knowledge. We can see that even in the works of modern scientists, Einstein, quantum physics, all physicists, most of them had a philosophical disposition in their thinking. Another aspect of Baha'i philosophy is that religion must be treated as a living organism, as a living phenomenon, not as a mechanical thing, not as a linear phenomenon, but something that grows, something that is living, something that is in contact with human civilization. Another aspect of Baha'i teachings is that, all ideas, including religions, have a historical context and philosophical origins. So, for instance, Abdul Baha, in some answered questions, in some discussions, uses older philosophical concepts. But what the Baha'i philosophy does, in other words, we are not saying that we have to rewrite the entire Baha'i philosophy, completely separated what has been written in the past, but rather the role of Baha'i philosophy is to reinterpret older philosophical frameworks. It must avoid fixation on the past, but move towards a synthesis of ideas and conflicting schools of philosophy.
Thank you.
A few more items I need to
that's
identify. Is another idea that is, in my understanding, is very interesting in Baha'i thinking that could have profound philosophical application, is that religion, the scope of religion could be viewed as a comprehensive philosophy, because religion, like philosophy, encompasses, nature of reality, epistemology, political philosophy, ethics, and so on. So based on that, in this new age, in this new time for the evolution of religion and philosophy, I think they can come together and seek coherence and synthesis, and complement together and work together and complement science together. There are some references in the Baha'i writings to, Western and Eastern philosophers. Like in Western philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, and acknowledge that they had enduring impact on the development of ideas. Very interesting. I would like to suggest that. I mean, I'm not perhaps the first person suggesting this. It is a big claim, but potentially Baha'i philosophy can make major attempts through future generations to come up with a very broad framework that could bring together the two branches of philosophy in Western thought, idealism of Plato and realism of Aristotle. I think that attempt could be a part of Baha'i approach to philosophy. And this is not, like even some scientists, like in modern times, in the West, like Alfred North Whitehead tried to do that. Or in Eastern philosophy, Mullah Sadra was one of the major, very prominent, genius Muslim philosophers, also attempted to do that. So I think along with all these developments, we have to really think about that creating that synthesis between ideal and real. The other one is, as I mentioned, the reconciliation of science and religion. And as a result of that, this is a very important topic. We don't have time to discuss it, but my understanding is that scientific method, what we call today scientific method, first of all, we have to remember scientific method as people use it, it's not, it's almost something new. It's 400 years old. From the time of experimentation, from the revolution that took place in Western culture, with the emergence of modernity, with the work of Galileo and Bruno and many others. When for the first time they said that we have to test, we have to observe, we have to use technology to interpret nature and so on. So this side of what is called today as science is, we have to remember that this is just a scientific method in terms of empirical approach. Empirical approach. Many people just randomly use the science, but science was a part of philosophy until the Middle Ages. So, having said that, my understanding is that this scientific method, this empiricism, must expand beyond narrow empiricism to include other concepts, such as consciousness-related phenomena. Perhaps we discussed that previously in that discussion of social sciences. The other thing is about the role of Baha'i philosophy is, as in modern philosophy is fragmented into specialized sciences and losing that integrated, holistic type of perspective. And that is a little bit dangerous, because philosophy must be universal. I mean, for the sake of knowledge, for the sake of communication, we can specialize on certain aspects of philosophy, like analytical philosophy or linguistics and so on. But we should never forget that holistic, that universal, that global picture of philosophy must never be compromised. And therefore, this reductionism and over-specialization in philosophy, in my view, if it goes into extreme, may obscure meaning and purpose and progress of philosophical outlook. Another item that I can mention is about the integration of facts and values in a Baha'i philosophical framework, that scientific facts are value-laden, and the idea is that true objectivity is unattainable. The Baha'i view, however, I think stresses scholarship with purpose. In other words, knowledge must contribute to material, intellectual, and spiritual development. And science and philosophy both possess double-edged potential for benefit or harm, depending on their values and how they are practiced. Two more items I have identified in terms of Baha'i philosophical framework is the concept of universality, that rational discourse alone is insufficient. So the idea is that revealed knowledge, that is the first impulse of religious dispensations, provides transformative power. That is the claim of Baha'i philosophy. Therefore, that revealed knowledge must be incorporated into ontology and epistemology and ethics and governance and political philosophy, which are the main domains of traditional philosophy. We cannot ignore that, just say that only metaphysics deals with that. His vision of Baha'u'lláh is to eradicate these divisions and create a unity of knowledge for the purpose of creating a material spiritual civilization. And finally, that in Baha'i philosophy, we need to overcome reductionism, dogmatism, and materialism, envisioning a dynamic, evolving understanding of truth. It is interesting that in the writings of Abdul Baha and Baha'u'lláh, both religious dogmatism and extreme materialism, fanatic materialism, are strongly criticized. However, Abdul Baha acknowledges broad-minded philosophers, even if they have materialistic outlook, but they are ready to communicate and in discourse and all that. So we have to be very careful about this, that when it comes to philosophical viewpoints that have a materialistic basis, it is not like a taboo. It's not that we are rejecting them, that we shouldn't study them. In fact, my understanding is that materialistic philosophies of modern times actually in some ways help religion, help spiritual principles, because they showed the shortcomings of religious traditions when they are faced with modern changes. When they became stagnant and fanatic and separated, they became like sociopolitical ideologies rather than a spiritually transcendental religion. So strong criticism of that from materialist philosophers somehow helped a better understanding of religion and spirituality. In Baha'i philosophy must include consciousness. It is a part, it is so, and I can elaborate further on that, but again, it's a limited time. And then, of course, that integrative philosophy can become as a guiding framework for Baha'i education and scholarship. And ultimately, a Baha'i-oriented philosophy cannot be expressed or remain in the realm of ideas. It is good to meditate, to talk about all that. There is a practical aspect to that, in my understanding. In other words, philosophy must be developed in order to help humanity to develop a sense of wholeness, a sense of unity, a sense of justice, and ultimately to establishing a civilization. Because a civilization needs a philosophical framework. In other words, there is an element of praxis in Baha'i philosophical framework. It has ideas, theoretical frameworks, but it also has an ending, a practical ending, a practical outcome, and that is a civilization.
Could you continue maybe and explain where the Baha'i studies would fit in all this? Or if you want, you can focus specifically on education instead. Yeah.
Actually, I was thinking about mentioning some areas, some themes, some issues, problems that could be discussed in social discourse and or so-called Baha'i social or Baha'i oriented or Baha'i inspired social theory. So what I thought was, if I can put together a kind of comprehensive but short definition of social theory in a very general sense from a Baha'i perspective. And I read this here, that a Baha'i-oriented social theory affirms a dynamic view of reality in which both spiritual truth and social order unfold in a continuous process of growth and renewal. It sees the universe as evolving and never static. The Baha'i writing describe creation as progressive, with religion renewed from age to age to meet humanity's changing needs. This principle of progressive revelation ensures that enduring spiritual truths remain the foundation, while social teachings adapt to new historical conditions. Civilization, then, is not fixed, but advances through cycles of transformation, each stage deepening humanity's understanding of justice, unity, and purpose. By integrating this vision, Baha'i social theory portrays social reality as an ever-advancing civilization, one that harmonizes timeless spiritual principles with the evolving requirements of human society. So I thought maybe with this, concise definition of social theory, we can identify subjects that are related to this perspective and are needed or are essential for further study, for the further scholarship, further research, further discourse and writing, and so on. Again, in short, based on what I read about this statement, Baha'i studies, if we want to summarize it, all aspects of Baha'i studies, whether I'm doing it from a sociological perspective or from educational perspective, or someone in the field of physics or biology. I mean, if anyone who wants to contribute to Baha'i studies, I mean, there are rooms for different fields of study to contribute. But the ultimate goal is, or outlook must be, let's put it in the context of civilization. Baha'i studies in the context of a civilization. See how vast the needs of our civilization are. From natural sciences, from natural order, to social order, to ethical order, to discourse, all of this. But if we think that way, that we are trying to establish a civilization, and therefore social studies must be aspects of this growing, emerging civilization, then it helps us to have a kind of better understanding of what we are doing. Now, after this, these are some of the areas that I have identified as traditional or present or future aspects or topics for Baha'i studies. The first one is still important, is that the compilation and classifications of the writings of the central figure of the faith and the Universal House of Justice that are essential. It was, it took place when I remember about my Iranian experience, most of the works, early works that were published were based on that kind of approach, which was very extremely helpful. So it created authoritative guidance, very easily, and ensure accessibility for common believers and for study and application. So by organizing these writings by subject and themes, that was another more advanced level. Both believers and institutions in the faith were able to draw upon this vast body of knowledge for their use and enabling them to address questions or challenges. And so it was a coherent framework that supported the spiritual, intellectual, and social development of the community at certain point in time. And I think the need for this is still there, and which is an ongoing process, if I understand it correctly. So that is, first we have to acknowledge that and the significance of doing that. The other area of scholarship, in my understanding, is in modern science and modern social developments, there are theories, there are ideas coming from different academic disciplines. So this requires, from a Baha'i scholarship perspective, careful identification of scientific dispositions that are relevant to Baha'i discourse. And then examples of this may include, theory of evolution, for instance, which is a very, very important, relevant, emerging concept. Political economy, ideas about human nature. I mentioned repeatedly the concept of consciousness. What is consciousness? What is spiritual psychology, so-called, and so on. And also because of this unifying framework that the Baha'i Faith has, I think philosophical ideas that are now prevailing in modern science regarding, a grand synthesizing theory of nature and the like is also an interesting subject for Baha'i scholars. It's, if I remember correctly, I think even Habermas, from a philosophical and sociological or social theory, approaches that the idea of grand synthesizing theory at one point in his works. I'm not sure about what I'm remembering, but perhaps that was the case. So I think that is very important. We identify areas that are discussed in scientific and philosophical and social discourse of our time, and then trying to reflect on it and develop a Baha'i response. Another area that again has been a very rich area in Baha'i literature, and I think it must continue, was the apologetic writings, basically aimed at defending the faith. The faith was developed in Iran, and of course it was vehemently attacked, persecuted, and therefore, as I mentioned, in that early stage, in the infancy of the faith, the nucleus of the faith in Iran, the first attempt that Baha'is did in terms of scholarship was first to compile the writings, the second to write apologetics, to defend the faith, to refute attacks and accusation, try to protect the community against misrepresentation and defamation and so on. So I think this work remains vital even today, even in places such as Iran, because since this is almost well known, since the Islamic Revolution started in Iran, believers have faced not only physical persecution, martyrdom, and so on. They have been the subject of media and public attack without being granted any right to them to defend themselves. So that is, and I think even in the future of Iran, even if the future Iran is brighter than what it is today, still there are forces that continue to attack the faith, particularly those groups that have very clear anti-Baha'i agenda. In the past, they will continue to do so, and even doing it today now. So this one. But I mean, in addition to that, similar challenges, I assume, will arise, or sometimes have also arisen in other parts of the world, in terms of some religious attack against the faith. There are some examples in Europe, some examples in the United States, but it was very limited. Perhaps this was because the Baha'i faith has not fully well known, and to the outside world, and therefore that may be the reason for that. So they have done that in the past. This may increase in the future. Not only that, I believe attack against the faith may not just come from a religious perspective or religious fanatics. Even some secular movements have the potential to see teachings of the faith as something that doesn't work with their agenda. And therefore, that could be the source that requires apologetic writings in order to respond to these potential challenges. I give one example from a political side. And that is, we know that the Baha'i Faith has a global character. And these are my speculation. This may never happen, but I'm saying it. But this global nature may be misinterpreted in light of the controversial assumptions about the concept of globalization. Because we know that globalization basically evokes both hope and apprehension among different diverse groups. But on the other hand, forget about the term globalization. There is a recognition that is beyond doubt that cries for the modern world that can no longer, some issues and problems of the world can no longer be addressed without collective collaboration and coming together of nations of the world. Just remove the concept of globalization, which misinterpreted these days. But the fact is, humanity needs to come together in order to work together, in order to face the challenges of modern times, from small to large, from wars to peace to, all of that. So therefore, clarification of this from a Baha'i perspective is very important, particularly Baha'i scholarship on political philosophy, on social issues, on laws and governance. These are very important. And the fact that Baha'i vision is not in conflict. This has to be elaborated and discussed with patriotism or national sovereignty. In fact, meaningful international cooperation depends upon strong, well-functioning national systems. This is sometimes one part of discourse that we may miss when talking these issues with people who are asking about the Baha'i approach. That Baha'i vision does not reject the importance of nation state. Rather, it affirms the continuing legitimacy of nation state as a legal and political entities. Because if we are moving toward the global system of governance, first we have to move from this well-established legal and political entity to move forward. We cannot establish a global governance, for instance, based on a vacuum. And so national interest, national identity shaped by history, culture, and language offers continuity and belonging, influencing new individuals to see themselves as and their place in the world. So the emergence of needs for global contribution and dialogue and collective security does not call for total dissolution of these identities. So therefore Baha'i approach must be, Baha'i scholarship must focus on how to integrate this identity, this nation state, this national identity into the broader framework of unity, when the integrity of each nation is preserved while contributing to a collective cooperative system of international system. So that was just another example that in terms of apologetic and in terms of the sources of misunderstanding of Baha'i teachings and how to respond to those. Another form of Baha'i studies has been well established already. It's mainly in Western world, in the United States and Europe, is that, and it still is a promising line of research approach to the Baha'i faith, that the goal is that Baha'i is another religion, another religious tradition within a broader field of religious studies departments. And the aim of this research or inquiry is to clarify the purpose and provide the necessary academic context by situating the Baha'i faith within the prevailing scholarly discourse on religion. Because the Baha'i faith is new, because it's not well known, so this attempt could be very useful in that regard. So this approach historically does not challenge the established norms of the academia, but seeks to basically demonstrate how the Baha'i faith can be understood alongside modern religious discourse. That is very important point. It's not that it is a religion that wants to establish a new civilization. It is maybe that part mentioned, but the main focus of this particular Baha'i studies approach has been just to introduce the faith within the parameters of dominant academic discourse in certain departments of like Middle Eastern studies, religious studies, history, as yet another modern religious movement, thereby broadening this comparative perspective for other scholars, which is very helpful. The next area that could be used as a topic for Baha'i studies is, I call it like introducing the faith, or scholarship that is aimed at introducing the faith as a paradigm. That is significantly different from the one that I just explained. It's the idea is that we need to articulate a new paradigm. And as we just said, that is rooted in the past, yet oriented toward the future. And this approach is necessary, or becoming more necessary, as inherited frameworks of thought reveal their limitations in addressing contemporary crisis. When other social studies they basically failed to address what is happening in the world. So the need for this paradigm approach will increase. So the purpose is not simply to situate the faith within existing faiths or within existing academic categories, but to introduce it as a bold idea that reimagine central theological and social concepts. It's revolutionary. Introduce it as an attempt to reimagine, to reframe central theological and social concepts. And that may include notions such as God, human soul, the role of religion in society, freedom, justice, and assigning new meanings to transcend traditional categories of scholarship. We know that paradigm represents a major shift in thought, They often demand new language and conceptual framework. So it is challenging then. So in the Baha'i text, articulating a vision of human progress, unity, and governance may require terms and constructs that move beyond conventional religious or political vocabularies. This is a potential situation that some scholars may face. Those contributions are not primarily about reproducing or citing the existing literature. Rather, they aim to reframe the intellectual discourse itself. This is a different approach. What I'm saying is like in the one that I before explained, that tries to introduce the faith as a part of faith, other religious traditions alongside those. Then they have to, obviously there must be major attempt to review the literature and back it up with literature. But with this paradigm approach, we still have to do that. I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but it is a little bit more difficult because the goal is to reproduce and reimagine and reframe intellectual discourse itself. And therefore, this has happened in the past. You see some of the modern philosophers came up with the new terminology because existing terminology could not really address their thinking, this explosion of thinking. And I always remember Sorokin, a sociologist, once criticizing that. In other words, he was like in favor of offering paradigm approach to discourse. And he said that we have gone too much into routine cliche type of producing materials, that even if Plato lives today and writes the Republic, perhaps publishers won't publish his book because it is so bold, it is so revolutionary. So while this paradigm shifting approach is vital, it is also bringing its own challenges, as I mentioned. It requires a careful and a skillful methodology to ensure that innovation does not delve into pure abstractions or lack of clarity. and accessibility. And if done thoughtfully, it can offer a transformative contribution to a scholarship, basically expanding the horizon of inquiry and showing the true nature of Baha'i teachings. Another area that I have established, I have assumed to be a source of further scholarship in the Baha'i faith is the concept of materialism. So let me explain briefly what do I mean by that. First, materialism is the language, the way it's expressed among people is about a way of living with emphasis on or giving priority on material well-being, seeking pleasure, wealth, fame, power, and neglecting the spiritual and transcendental part of human soul. So that's one definition for prevailing concepts of materialism. The other one is materialism as a philosophical framework, as a philosophy and way of interpreting the nature of reality, and which, for instance, materialism rejects the concept of God, human spirit as a metaphysical phenomenon, and religion as a divine reality, or life after death, and so on. And materialism, in this philosophical sense, advances the idea that matter is the organizing substance of reality. Now, Baha'i thinking is rejecting that, obviously. But Baha'i writing also distinguish between dogmatic or crass materialism and broad-minded works of philosophy that contributes to philosophical discourse even with a materialistic persuasion. This is what I explained briefly a few minutes ago. And that's my understanding. Now, there is a third aspect of materialism, which is really the focus of my understanding is major issue, and that is materialism. It seems to me that has becoming like the organizing principle of existing civilization. Let's put it that way. It's like a regime. It's like the modus operandi of the existing culture. So it's a general tendency of civilization to define reality, existence, the world, hatta arts and science, philosophy, religion, moral values, norms, all of these come within the parameters of a materialistic worldview. And also viewed as being intertwined with the structural problems of existing global civilization. Hence the crisis of our time, if we assume this is correct, that this assumption is correct, which I can back it up, if we have time, but we don't, with sufficient philosophical, sociological, and historical evidences. But so if we accept or somehow agree with this assumption, therefore it shows us that the crisis that we are facing in the world is not just maladjustment of a single entity, or in politics, in international relations, in this or in that, but it's basically about the material, this broad definition of materialism on the trajectory of civilization. So materialism as a worldview has all these elements. And while, technological advances and economic prosperity have fueled some of this materialistic gratification, but still it's not that. We don't have to blame technology. We don't have to blame certain political system or economic system, but rather to really go through the essence of this metaphysical anxiety, this materialistic alienation that exists. Recently, I was speaking somewhere, and I mentioned that this famous Marx in Communist Manifesto, when he mentioned in 1848 that began with that there is a ghost basically traveling or over Europe, and that is communism. I thought if I want to reinterpret to explain my position here, I just want to say that there is a ghost now, not over Europe, but all the world, over the entire planet, and that is materialism. And so basically, if we do research, we have to investigate how materialism functions, not merely as an economic or cultural tendency, but as overarching system of values. That is the point. System of values. It's not just some greedy. When you go for shopping, you express some greedy attempt to buy more or to eat more. It is much more than that. It is overarching system of values and thinking. And particular attention could be given to the relationship between materialism and concepts that are emerged from that, such as alienation, the loss of human dignity, existential anxiety or dissatisfaction, and the weakening of social cohesion. These are the areas for social research. Inquiry should explore how materialistic motivation can even infiltrate religion itself, where symbols, rituals, and institutions risk being co-opted for power and status rather than genuine spiritual expression. So, and because of that, this if that happens, it fuels religious extremism and stagnation. And transforming faith, religion, spirituality, ethics into instrument for material gains and political control. So these efforts, this scholarship approach, have the potential to clarify this, how materialism, whether in secular form or religious form, undermines the moral and spiritual foundation of society. The next item that I identified, I try to be shorter explanation because it's already becoming too lengthy, is that I just mentioned it, and that is Baha'i research and scholarship are important or becoming more and more important, particularly in higher education, to employ interdisciplinary methods or promote an integrative or interdisciplinary approach to knowledge. This is very important because my assumption is that the concept or the vision of unity of knowledge in the Baha'i faith, when expressed in the mechanism of education, research, studies, all that, naturally, automatically finds an interdisciplinary dimension. And the fact is, most problems of the world are interrelated, and we cannot study them separately, from the environment to wars to drug cartels to from smaller to bigger issues. When we look at it, we see a combination of disciplines, approaches, methodologies that must come together in order to find a solution. So I think if we advance this, either in the research that we produce or encourage it for other research in education or other fields, it would be very helpful and very significant contribution to Baha'i scholarship. Another important is, obviously, we discussed that, is the research and scholarship that explore the harmony of science and religion. This is new. This is not new. It's been a part of Baha'i scholarship in the West, particularly in the past 40, 60 years. My understanding is that, we now must move beyond traditional approaches that focus only on, let's say, mutual respect or acknowledgement of both domains, science, religion, both are good, work together, something like that. My understanding is that what is required is, along the communication between science and religion, is to work on developing a new epistemology, one that redefines prevailing conceptions of reality and the scientific method, giving rise to an emerging paradigm of inquiry, fundamentally distinct from earlier approaches. So a discussion of harmony between science and religion can be approached on multiple levels. In general, it involves examining their historical relationship and identifying the factors that have led to periods of both divergence and convergence. However, a deeper level requires engaging with the philosophical foundation of materialism and reductionism. That is, going back to the previous discussion that we had, so that could lead us to a framework that revealed the necessity of a more integrative approach between the material and spiritual dimensions of civilization. And also illuminate or encourage how the Baha'i worldview is reflected in emerging normative values across religious, philosophical, and social thought. That, what I mean, it brings to light how the Baha'i dispositions spiritual principles has permeated and influenced the constructive findings or developments of our time. Now, here is a very critical point. I'm not suggesting that we should go and superimpose Baha'i doctrine, Baha'i teachings, Baha'i view, Baha'i assumptions on these values that are emerging from different disciplines. But rather, my understanding is that there are sufficient data and evidence and normative values emerging from science itself, disregard of the Baha'i faith, in different disciplines, from natural sciences to, when I say natural sciences, I mean their philosophical implications, of course, and then social sciences. What's happening in political economy, in political philosophy, in the field of ethics, in the field of history, in the field of sociology, social theory in general, all of that. So there are sufficient evidences that we have to go, as a Baha'i researcher, identify those. Instead of superimposing Baha'i view on that, establish dialogue with those areas, those already established, accepted, acknowledged values and meanings and norms that are coming from different disciplines. So this discourse must be really aware of dynamic interplay between what has been written in the past, what has been done in the past, and what will be the future, between basically change and stability and continuity of the research. By accepting that, in other words, we cannot really disregard completely the tradition, the background, the literature, all of that, and just base the future model based on a vacuum, established on a vacuum. So there must be a constant dialogue between what has already been said and done in different disciplines and what needs to be done, and then how Baha'is can contribute to this. So by framing in social teachings as instrument that foster spiritual growth, they can demonstrate how Baha'i vision harmonizes this stability and renewal in the development of knowledge. Again, this was really the most difficult part of today's discussion, because it has so many dimensions. I may not be able, I perhaps didn't really serve this subject properly, but anyway, it needs much more discussion. Another area that I identified was, I called it civilizational studies. It basically means, as a social entity, we need to focus on civilizations. It doesn't mean we should not focus on, let's say, local places, regional, national, this doesn't reject that. But we have to have a vision, a perspective that is somehow in contrast to the study of particular societal entities. And then seek to examine broader patterns and dynamics that shape the course of human history. This focus on civilization, and in that by itself, we could go to modern ideas about civilization, clashes of civilization, the reality of these clashes of civilization, the very fact that the internal and external chaos in civilization, all of these, we see this concept is coming up, even from conflicting sources. Conflicting sources still, when used, still use civilization in their vocabulary. Anyway, and in this context, I just want to mention something that in the context of civilizational studies, I think the study of Western civilization is particularly valuable, because we know in the Baha'i writings, both acknowledge many positive contributions of Western civilization, and that sometimes critique its shortcomings, mainly because of the absence of a strong spiritual component. However, there is one thing that needs further clarification, and that is the medium of Western culture as a powerful vehicle for advancing the spirit of the faith has not been sufficiently recognized. In a sense that even though the Western culture has its own crisis, and as I said, perhaps this crisis of materialism is stronger than any other culture in Western civilization. But when we consider the totality, the culmination of all civilizations throughout historical development and the development of progress in technological and scientific progress that took place since the emergence of modernity, and the social institutions and ideas of human rights, and basically major developments that came under the category of New World Order after perhaps the First World War, with the establishment of the League of Nations and the United Nations, and there's so many other factors. And even though this new world order is experiencing some dissolution, some cracking or disappearing in it, but I think still is a powerful sociopolitical structure, and we should not forget that. And these challenges that now exist now, I think these are corrective challenges. And so therefore we have to really have this, because conversely, I've noticed some works of scholarship reflect excessive negativity toward the West, often shaped more by cultural or political biases than by a balanced assessment of what Western culture means. This is not something to defend my assumption or my proposition, but it has crossed my mind that it's a striking example when Abdu'l-Bahá decided, after years of exile and imprisonment, to direct his steps towards the West. What did he discern as potential for the growth of the faith in those societies? Too often, we say the materialism of the West is presented as the reason for his journey, as though his aim were solely to save it from its spiritual decline. That could be a part of it. But it is equally important, however, to consider that the West may have been more receptive than any other region in the world at this time to hear, embrace, and spread his message. Hopefully we are getting closer to the end. The next item that I identified is it's the idea that relationship between spiritual principles and social teachings of the faith. We know that Bahá'í scholarship on racial harmony, on economic justice, gender equality, these are have long been central to the faith and effective in engaging social discourse. Actually, Abdu'l-Bahá, when he came to the West, he heavily emphasized that. But if you carefully review his talks in the West, he discussed all of these issues, but he initiated his discourse, his lecture, with the need for Holy Spirit, for a spiritual renewal, and then expanded it into social teachings. So, and now we know that some of these social principles have become mainstream these days. So therefore, my understanding is that we need to basically frame these social teachings of the faith within the spiritual foundation, within the spiritual context of the faith. Why this is happening now, more important now, because there is so much misunderstanding about these social teachings, social principles. And if we do not incorporate it within the social context, what may happen is that we may, risk being misrepresented, just as a secular movement for social change. And a discourse centered only on social issues may create the impression that the Baha'i faith is just a new liberal reform movement, rather than a comprehensive spiritual path with a transformation, with the goal of transforming global vision for a new civilization. There is a profound differences between these two interpretations. So I think that is very important. In the Baha'i framework, spiritual teachings are the core, and the social vision radiates outwardly from that core, from that center, from that foundation. So we have to preserve that, so that social teaching faithfully reflect Baha'u'llah's intent and reveals the spiritual foundation of civilization. So if the spiritual center is neglected or subordinated, however, the resulting discourse may shift into various cultural trends or mixed up with various cultural trends, political ideologies, or academic theories, losing its universal perspective, a spiritual foundation, and failing to express the deeper vision upon which Baha'u'llah civilization must be established. So now it is perfectly fine and useful to discuss modern social reform ideas that are present, for instance, in the writings and speeches of Abdul Baha's worldview. But we should never forget linking it and starting the discourse with that spiritual foundation. Because if the argument is to fixate solely on the secondary outcome and overlook, that root cause of this social renewal, particularly in the context of progressive revelation, it may, we may miss the broader perspective of his teachings. Let me say something here about that Baha'i teachings has a united or unified view of, it was like a universe of ideas with a central core and social periphery. And then we have to understand that, there is a in one of the writings of Baha'u'llah on, I think it's in Seven Valleys, that he says, a believer must in the sea finds a drop, and in a drop sees the secret, or the secrets of the sea. I mean, I'm just paraphrasing. See the drop from the sea, and the sea see the drop, vice versa. So that is very interesting example. It's a profound statement that the whole vision must be reflected, the whole vision of Baha'u'lláh must be reflected in every single teaching of the faith. And likewise, every single teaching of the faith must reveal the broader and totality of Baha'u'llah's teachings. So this from small to the universal, from the universal to the part, is a two-way necessary relationship from a Baha'i perspective. See, as I said, these social principles such race unity, gender equality, economic justice, all these must be viewed in their dynamic interaction and in the context of the whole Baha'u'llah's ocean of knowledge and understanding. Otherwise, when you study and focus these social issues independently outside of that universal social spiritual foundation, what happens is the outcome is like a mosaic or meaningless mosaic of fragments, fragmented pieces put together. So this is so therefore, Baha'i principle of the oneness of humanity, and within this spiritual foundation must navigate this identity-based struggles for justice, preventing societal fragmentation, and orienting diversity towards unity. That is within that spiritual foundation. I think this is one of the critical areas of discourse for Baha'is. Along with that comes with the focus on, we mentioned Baha'u'lláh, spirituality and all that. I think we need more research and scholarship with candid discourse on Baha'u'llah's role as the promised figure of all religious dispensation and his unique station, going back to that paradigm type of approach. So therefore we have to discuss in our scholarship how Baha'u'lláh redefined religion, how he warned of chaos that ensue when the light of religion is extinguished, and how he underscored the necessity of placing God at the center of human worldviews. So therefore, it's I know it is doing that is both intellectually compelling and spiritually profound, and really with challenges. So along with that, again, there is a need for Baha'i studies to explore the spiritual void that exists in modern society. Everybody, even in daily life, people are experiencing it. Understood as more than the decline of organized religion, but as a deep sense of alienation, lack of purpose, moral fragmentation. So this line of inquiry and scholarship must examine how this materialism, ethical, moral vacuum, identity crisis, all of these erode human well-being, and how Baha'i teachings through divine standards, spiritual renewal, and the balance of material and spiritual tries to offer a framework for true prosperity. Do we have time?
Yeah, we do.
Okay. I think I have 2 more, items. Another idea that I think is very important is that a scholarship into the concept of liberalism. I mean, liberalism has provided profound contribution to knowledge, to human understanding, to modern times. It expands rights, autonomy, room for dissent. It's been historically an engine of social progress, emphasized pluralism, human rights, consensus building. These are all contributions of modern liberalism. However, there are challenges that we need to be aware of and see what would be Baha'i response to these challenges. One is that, as I mentioned, that moral spiritual void. The other one is how liberalism, drifts from neutral place for coexistence to some kind of orthodoxy by itself. That is another one. The idea that economic aspect of liberalism, we don't have time to discuss that. The idea of expanding human neighborhood into global picture, but it is good, but there are challenges, and how these challenges can be addressed. I mentioned identity politics and social cohesion. So this group absolutism that we now see among different sectors of the society, if there is not a universal framework, it erodes common purpose, results in diversion. And so liberalism promise endures to some extent, but it must be reintegrated with a shared moral purpose and a renewed emphasis on character, morality, rectitude of conduct, and conscience. This is a huge task, needs lots of explanations, I know, but I try to summarize it while acknowledging its positive nature, the challenges that it is facing. Well, I just want to give one example that, for example, one of the broad-minded philosophers of liberalism was Adam Smith, the father of capitalism. But you see, I think I mentioned this in the past or other discussions, but the system of free enterprise that he established, which was very sophisticated and helpful, but his assumption was that there is a moral order and people are, there is a fear of God in people's hearts. And there is a moral order, and God is at the center of their universe. So with that assumption, he said, okay, this could become a very successful economic model. Assumed he could never foresee, I mean, maybe he could, but he did not foresee what happened in 19th and early 20th century in terms of dominance of materialism and neglect of religion and downplaying of values and so on. So the problem is, in other words, when we talk about liberalism, in fact, liberalism produced people like Adam Smith. But then there are new realities. And the idea is that, another vanity was perhaps the idea that liberalism is the end of history. It has answered that question of finality and exclusivity that I use for religious traditions, that if we use that for liberalism and not trying to advance it, reinterpret it, reframe it, then we experience the same stagnation that religions experience. Another area of course, research is education. Education, constitutes a vital domain of research and scholarly inquiry in the Baha'i teaching, in the Baha'i framework. And by education, I mean not just schooling, but educational philosophy, educational theory, curriculum development, social foundations of learning, social and psychological foundations of learning, moral and spiritual dimension of education, and also education at every level, from childhood through higher education, from education at home to institutionalized religion. So we are talking about this very broad perspective of education, and there are rooms for extensive research and development in this area. There were significant contributions in the past. Just Anissa model comes to my mind that demonstrated the potential for Baha'i-inspired approaches. But this field of inquiry requires much deeper exploration. And I think education is so essential. And what I understand from Baha'i teaching is that education is understood. When we know that Baha'u'lláh says manifestations of God are like educators, that carries a lot of meaning. So education is understood as gravity that sustains the entire tree of knowledge. Education may not appear to have much content in itself. However, it provides the essential structure through which all branches of knowledge are nourished and enabled to flourish in order to establish civilization, or in order to transfer knowledge and civilization from one generation to the next. So we have to look at it as this really, really significant point. We have the tree of knowledge. We have, in a previous discussion, we discussed the knowledge structure in Comte. But again, we discussed that it is the process of education that gives shape and purpose and direction to the totality of these natural and social branches of knowledge. Another, briefly, this is not really related to things that I discussed, but crossed my mind that there are research that perhaps it's maybe good for Baha'i physicians to do research, or Baha'i who have expertise in biology, in genes, and so on. Research shows that cultural norms, social behaviors, and environmental factors, such as diet, stress, trauma, they can influence human physiology and altering genes, even gene expression. This is a new area, but considering this totality of Baha'i perspective, I thought these studies reveal that severe, experiences like social experiences, severe social experiences like war, like famine, like oppression, they are passed on to next generation, as seen in children of Holocaust survival. So there are certain evidences that the decline in moral and social values can also contribute to chronic stress, fragmentation, and instability, which not only affect the individual health, but also transmit through, as a mechanism, shaping behavior and predispositions over time. I think this idea, which is perhaps in its infancy, can in the future really provide further insight about values and so on. The last item that I want to discuss is the concept of non-partisanship. We are living in a time of partisanship, and we see it everywhere. It's a global phenomenon, not only between the countries, but within countries. So I thought we need to go beyond, moral restraint, because, as a matter of self-discipline, because it's a part of teachings, we resist, partisan impulses. It must be grounded in a deeper knowledge. So I called it epistemological or epistemology of non-partisanship. I specifically use this broad philosophical framework just to emphasize the importance of this non-partisanship, that it is not just the teaching of the faith to protect Baha'is. It is a part of our worldview. It is a part of how we see things. It's a way of knowing, as I said. It reflects an integrated approach to truth and knowledge that enables individuals, that integrated approach helps us to rise above ideological polarization. Rise above polarization. Because again, we can, through effort, just as some sort of obedience to teachings, try to rise above ideological polarization. But that is not enough, and it could break down at any moment as the division in the society intensifies. So there must be a deeper understanding and appreciation of this. Without this grounding, I call it grounding, non-partisanship may become kind of superficial, or leading a mentality of two-ness. In other words, meaning privately expressing partisan alignment, but in public remain neutral. this undermines our integrity. Authentic non-partisanship is a principled, dynamic orientation that sustains fairness, unity, and meaningful contributions to public discourse. It also flows from the Baha'i conviction that lasting change requires universal spiritual, moral, and social transformation beyond partisan frameworks or rivalry and division of parties. These are just sample of this need. And we have to cultivate compassion and solidarity with humanity's suffering in general. But this must be guided by kind of impartial truth-seeking principle rather than just ideologies. So I think further research and scholarship is needed into how Baha'i teachings offer a constructive alternative to the ideological divide that dominates contemporary public. We can learn from the teachings of Abdul-Baha, the way that throughout his life, in actual life, the way that he practiced this. Again, that is a subject by itself, but we don't have time to go through that. So, so further research is needed for this constructive alternative to this ideological divide that between or the course discourse between liberal and conservative positions. Whereas, this is we have to go beyond that. And going beyond that, above that, it requires further epistemological understanding of human reality, of social reality, and Baha'i teachings. For instance, from a liberal perspective or liberal thought, often, emphasize collective responsibility, social justice, state intervention and constructive based approach or conservative approach. I mean, basically what I'm saying is that from a liberal perspective, the idea that is focused, this is just an example, that there must be in society a collective responsibility, emphasizing social justice, a state intervention to help people. So there are elements of this if we carefully examine in the Baha'i teachings. At the same time, there are some conservative thoughts in the Baha'i teachings, stressing individual self-reliance, free market, moral accountability, work as a service, as a worship, importance of work, individual work, that everybody have a trade and so on. So when we look at this, we see both orientations are present. So therefore, a scholarship must help us to see how we can bring up these into a higher synthesis, showing that how the Baha'i perspective is a balance, provides a balance here in this in the relationship between these items, and so that balance that by itself is a very fascinating topic. But here I would say balance in the Baha'i faith is not just some sort of mechanical equation of, equal amount of two items coming together. No, that is not balance. Balance is developing a living rhythm, bringing these opposing perspectives into a living, synthesizing perspective, not just putting them together equally. This is equal conservative, equal liberal. No, we have to mix them, integrate them into a living example for further research. As I said, in the Baha'i writings, affirm the responsibility of government. This is another example to address poverty, reduce the extremes of wealth and, the deprivation. At the same time, upholds the dignity of labor, the spiritual value of work, the moral responsibility of each individual to contribute meaningfully to society. So this dual emphasis on institutional responsibility for justice and personal responsibility through purposeful work. This illustrates what we are trying to say, that there must be a holistic, a balance, a living balance approach to social development rather than a one-sided solution. And research in this area could also examine how such framework transcend partisanship, grounds civic engagement in principles of unity and cooperation, and provides a spiritually informed model for advancing justice, prosperity, and human dignity in this increasingly polarized world. So these were some of the items that I could identify as historically developed methods of scholarship and some new emerging areas for scholarship that I tried to put together.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You have offered a philosophical view of Baha'i scholarship and education. And so I think I really appreciate having this very broad platform with which to engage. What I want to do quickly is to go back to the diagram that we had with the three phases.
Yes.
And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to very quickly talk about it and share some of my own observations, which are not extremely important, but I think it would be interesting to provide some kind of engagement to what you've put forward. And then I might ask, or you might, I mean, you can feel free to engage with those, or I would probably have a question at the end, which you could choose to engage or not, depending on how you feel, because you've been presenting for a while. So I want to go back. The reason I want to return to this scheme, to this diagram, is because I want to emphasize the fact that the transition from the first stage to the second stage or phase of your development model would always constitute one of the key epistemological challenges facing any religious community. So it is basically I'm saying it is a sensitive time. It is a delicate transition, right? And so now I'm going to mention a few observations that can figure maybe as challenges or opportunities that I find important or, at this point in time for myself. And you should feel free to add or discuss more about that once I run through them. So I'll try to do it quite quickly. I think one opportunity, which is also a challenge in phase one. So I'd like to start a little bit with phase one, but really they impact phase two, because I would posit or presume that we are in between these two phases. I think one amazing transformation that is likely to occur very soon is that all the writings of Bahá'u'lláh and maybe of other figures will likely be translated in English for the first time, while previously, so until now, only 10% or so of the writings of Bahá'u'lláh, I think less than 10% of the writings of Bahá'u'lláh have been available to the English-speaking world. So I think that has it's an opportunity in the sense, and a challenge, but it's an opportunity in the sense that it will likely change Bahá'í scholarship in key ways that are difficult to predict, basically. So that's one that I wanted to mention for phase one. And a second one for phase one, which I think is quite important, in particular in relation to the writings of the Bahá'í Faith, because they are so the writings of the Bahá'í Faith are generally tablets written to particular individuals. So they are very situated in a socio-historical context. Therefore, and also, so the question emerges: how do you situate these writings in their historical context? And not only the writings, but the actual history of the religion itself. And then how do you do that, particularly when the context is extremely intense, full of turmoil and massive transformations? So the context of the 18th century, really 19th century rather. So the context of the 19th century, when you have religious, you have transition from religious to secular societies, from absolutist monarchies to parliamentary monarchies and republics, from theology to modern sciences, for the scientific revolution, from agriculture to modern industry and technology, and so on. So if you assume that religious writings operate in a sort of transcendental, universalist way, you might miss something essential about the contingent responses provided to very important historical questions. So basically what I'm trying to say here, in short, is that there needs to be some kind of agreement between the historical methodology that, the methodology of the field of history, and the narratives and the traditions of religion in terms of how they have interpreted their own history, and even some of their own writings. There is a sort of distinction or possible tension which needs to be resolved, and it's really important for that to be resolved, I would say, in phase one, because the rest has to fit after this problem has been somewhat addressed. So that would be my kind of take on phase one. And on phase two, I'll try to go through it faster. Phase one might be, so these are potential problems, I think. So phase one might be too disconnected from phase two might be too disconnected from phase one contributions, including sometimes the original sacred writings or the compilations produced. Or it might just underutilize them. Apologetics this is the second one. Apologetics might dominate scholarship, or scholarship might have an instrumental purpose. Another one, the contributions in the first phase might not be strong or comprehensive enough to support the transition to the second phase. I also observed, for example, in the field of education, some non-linearity. So we have had phase two contributions in phase one. For example, the Anissa model that you've mentioned in the 70s. But then there was no continuity of that in phase two. And it is as if that has kind of never existed. And I think this problem of non-linearity has a deeper origin, which is the transition from phase one to phase two might occur. It might occur sometimes without taking into account, and more essentially, without ordering in terms of the quality of scholarship, the types of contributions made in the past. So such an ordering cannot really occur except naturally as part of a field of studies where authors read each other and comment upon each other. However, maybe many such fields of study do not have enough Baha'i authors, or the few Baha'i authors that operate in various schools that do not engage each other, leaving such fields as inchoate or underdeveloped at best. So what I'm saying here is basically, if Baha'i authors do not read each other and do not engage each other, they do not produce a sort of hierarchical ordering of the quality of contributions in that field. So then it is difficult to build on the field itself. The field produces new things without really the foundation of the past. Another problem can be the tendency to draw strict equivalences, or what you referred to as the superimposition of Baha'i language. So instead of translating the language of the revelation, you just try to superimpose it over social disciplines, or you try to only accept aspects that you think fit with your, you draw strict equivalences. You think these theories fit with my paradigm and other theories don't fit, or other authors don't fit, and so forth. When we draw strict equivalences, a question is, for me, is what is the basis for that, or what are the tenets we rely on for making such strict comparisons, and then have those been examined or re-examined in a reflective manner. Another key one, I think, which emerges from your talk very clearly, is that the curriculum that is supposed to take you from phase one to phase two, it seems that it has to be interdisciplinary, or maybe even integrative if possible. But you might not have that. So that could be a limitation. And I mean, there could be all sorts of curricula doing all sorts of things, but basically, maybe interdisciplinarity is really important in the transition from phase one to phase two. I guess that's what I'm trying to say. Another issue is, which we haven't discussed, there might be limits to how far religion can contribute to the academic disciplines, and not acknowledging such limits or limitations might be an issue. I am thinking here mostly of Frank Lewis arguing that the Baha'is cannot produce a distinctively Baha'i methodology in the academic disciplines, except perhaps in terms of the ethics of what we do with what we know, and how we consultatively adjudicate conflicting truth claims. I see this perspective as a sort of minimalist position. So there is a debate within the Baha'i community between a minimalist position of this kind and other positions. And I think the last observation, and this is becoming a question if you want to address it, although you have addressed it today, but maybe more specifically, you would like to address it. When you speak about comprehensive philosophy, how would we extract that? I mean, is this broad philosophy already visible and accessible in the Baha'i writings, or is that something you develop through this model of an interdisciplinary curriculum? And how do you go by it in phase one and phase two? So phase one, do you map the teachings of the Baha'i faith in a certain way? And phase two, you start using, and this is what you've been discussing so far, you start identifying either key themes in scholarly discourse in the scientific domains and so forth, and start analyzing them from within those fields, and then relate that back and forth with the teachings of the religion and so forth. Sorry, it hasn't been very, very clear, but feel free to engage with what I've said in any way you want. I think a lot of discussion maybe in the future could be about the broad philosophy or comprehensive philosophy and the method for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Excellent. You discuss very profound issues, and each one of them require really a independent research and dialogue. Actually, that discourse, social discourse. And what I can say is that, first of all, the first thing that crossed my mind is that the relationship between these three phases is not very, systematic. In other words, it's not like, I know you didn't mean that, and it's obvious to you, but the point is not like phase one is a mechanical thing, and when we are done with it, we go to the phase two. And when we are done with the phase two, we go to the phase three. It reminds me of the 7 valleys of Bahá'u'lláh, that you can jump from a state of search to complete a state of annihilation, personal annihilation. So it's a journey in a sense. So that's the first thing that comes to my mind. And therefore, and I said that in the beginning, and I repeat that, it is just a pattern. It may not fully be descriptive of how education and scholarship emerged in different dispensations, but roughly speaking, we can observe the same trajectory. So that is another thing that I have to emphasize that. And let's go back to the phase one. You see, first we have a nucleus of new knowledge, and then we have immediate cultural environment. Let's say in the context of the Bahá'í Faith, it was Shia Islamic discourse, the immediate cultural environment. And then in terms of even geographic expansion of the faith, we can clearly see that it was not a Western phenomenon until later on. So, and then scientific, theological, and philosophical knowledge of the surrounding environment was perhaps what was happening in the world, in the Western world, in terms of scientific revolution, modernity, all the changes and all that. So there are stages from immediate cultural environment to more broader discourse, environmental discourse. And then, of course, in the phase two, it just shows the exchange of ideas between these concentric circles. It's just a period of dialogue, exchange, going from infancy to more advanced stage of maturity and all that. So the other thing that came to my mind was the development of these phases may be impacted by culture, geography, and different places. For instance, the faith was originated in Iran. Obviously, the first phase, the first here, very well, very comfortably fit with the Baha'i development in Iran. But in some other countries, perhaps it may not be like that. For instance, in Iran, because of the particularly, as I said, severe attack and persecution against the faith, against the community, the two major ideas or two major methodologies, well advanced. One was compilation of the writings, and also compilation related to specific aspects of Baha'i practice, or compilation on the holy days, on compilation on the laws of Aqdas, compilation on social teachings, and so on. And then the other one was responding to attacks against the faith, responding against the faith. So it was really Baha'i scholars produced extensive, very valuable materials in doing these two, serving these two areas of scholarship. Until, let's say, again, I'm talking very roughly, until 60s and maybe 70s in Iran, then we could see elements of emergence of the relationship or dialogue with the broader environment, the scientific, philosophical knowledge of surrounding environment. So at that time, there were some translation of the writings of some Western Baha'is, and then a new generation of scholars in Iran came into power, came into action, or producing materials that were, in a sense, traditional Baha'i scholars that focused on compilation and apologetics, and yet they had deeper knowledge of Western philosophy, Western ideas, and modernity. A group of these people, some of them went to the West, studied, came back to Iran, contributed to Baha'i scholarship. Individuals like, I don't know, like Dr. Dawoodi, Dr. Muhammad Baqir Hushyar, Dr. Shapur Rasikh. I'm sorry if I don't remember. There were many, many distinguished names who contributed to even establishing, bringing the stage of infancy to the third section. So that was the situation of Iran. In the West, compilation was a part of Baha'i scholarship. Apologetics were not that significant. They were produced, but that because of the complete socio-political situation, that did not, perhaps there was no need for that degree of producing apologetics. I think that may change in the future, not just from religious perspective, but also, as I mentioned, from secular, political, all those areas. But something that emerged in the West was like in the 60s and early 70s, there were individuals who had rich background in scholarly knowledge and university knowledge and disciplines, and they started developing ideas about the dialogue between Baha'i and scientific, theological, and philosophical ideas of our time. There again, there are a number of people, I don't remember most of them at this point, Dr. William Hatcher, Dr. Daniel Jordan in education, Hatcher in philosophy and social sciences. Anyway, these people really contributed to this new approach. And in fact, the Association for Baha'i Studies initially was developed as a part of this process to establish dialogue between bringing the faith from that period of infancy, or that scholarship into higher interaction and dialogue with the social issues of our time, or political or philosophical topics of our time. So as you see, I gave you these two examples of Iran and the United States and perhaps Europe to see that, first of all, it's not been a linear way of doing things. Things go up and down, change, go back to the origin, become like act like the period of infancy, and then act in another situation with maturity, more maturity. So that is the case, and also clearly show that how two different sociocultural environments produced different types of scholarship. Well, I had once I can give you some personal example. It's interesting that I remember I wrote a paper to a Baha'i journal in Iran that was like equivalent of the world order that was used to publish in the United States. It was Ahang Badi. So it was about, something about education, a scholarship, a Baha'i scholar and all that. But there was in it a reference to Marxism and communism and not defending this actually. Actually, I was saying that that a scholar was a critique of communism when he was teaching at the university, but when the Communist Party was disbanded in Iran after the 1953 revolution or change, or some people call it coup d'etat and so on. So anyway, so it was just that. And then because of the political environment in Iran, the editors of that journal, even though they loved the article, were so sensitive about these references to communism. And so we somehow managed that, and it was published. But when I came to the United States, I said, oh my God, this is a totally different environment. You can talk about anything. In other words, not anything. What I'm saying is, it was like a cultural shock to me to see the differences between how a Baha'i can express himself in two different cultures, in two different environments. So these are all issues that can be related to this. You mentioned something about interdisciplinary and core curriculum and education. I think that is so important. I have done my best in my research studies and practices in education, in higher education, to advance in whatever capacity that I was working, to advance the idea of interdisciplinary, and I think a future belongs to interdisciplinary studies. Future. And I think, and I have developed core curriculum for some institutions of higher learning. And again, core curriculum is a subset of this interdisciplinary approach that, for instance, universities, they offer general education courses like math and reading, and then specialized courses in biology or in computer science and all that. But then there must be a space between this, and that is usually called core curriculum. That is, courses are offered in that space that are neither general education or a specialized area. They are there to give a broader perspective, a universal perspective about unity of knowledge, about how different disciplines are interrelated, and how we have to look at science and our knowledge in order to not to be trapped into a specialization. When you become too much trapped in a specialization, like in engineering or in biology, then to the degree that you cannot even communicate with someone from music, from literature. So the whole idea of curriculum, core curriculum, was to basically accommodate a specialization with general knowledge and create a universal interdisciplinary perspective about knowledge, about purpose, about value of science, and so on. And if you look at the way that core curriculum and interdisciplinary developments, even though they are very difficult to achieve, particularly in modern scheme of higher education, from the way that they are assessed, degrees are assessed, the grades are assessed. I mean, there are so many challenges on the way. But ultimately, I think the future of higher education and even secondary education and even elementary education will benefit immensely from ideas in interdisciplinary and core curriculum principles. And so that is one thing that I'm really interested in that area. So perhaps in a second,
So,
in another discussion, we can discuss that.
So just to clarify for whoever is not very used to the educational concept, so a core curriculum would be a series of modules within an academic program organized in a particular way, in a very well-planned way that will be offered to all the students,
to all the students,
on all the programs.
All the programs, yes.
And so and that, when we say well-planned, that means well-planned with respect to all the programs of all those students.
Exactly.
In the scheme of knowledge and so forth. So it is complicated, and we can say that also interdisciplinary curricula are very expensive for that reason. Because you require the staff to also function at that level. So it's a higher level of complexity, which requires more resources of all kinds.
Yes, but despite all this, a good number of universities around the world have adopted to some extent these types of programs. Like, instead of, you just said it very well. All students must take that, whether they are studying for computer science or biology or whatever. And the point is, there are a number of courses. Maybe it varies from university to university. Maybe from 20 credit hours to 30 credit hours sometimes. And the whole thing is, instead of, let's say, a study, I mean, I just give one example. A study of civilization. In other words, civilization 1, civilization 2. In many of these core curriculum programs, these are example of courses that can give that fit for that purpose. And it goes back to what we discussed here today in terms of the significance of looking at the world from a civilizational perspective. Because when you look at civilization, you are naturally should look into culture, norms, values, ethics, education, religion, demographic, all those aspects. It's not just one particular area. So when we assume when students take civilization 1 or 2, at the end, they will have a very broad perspective about every civilization, every culture that transcends history and particularity of geography and so on and so forth. These are two examples. I've written paper. I'm working on it on core curriculum. It's I hope if I finish it, I can somehow make it available. But that is a very important point. One more, sure.
No, go ahead, go ahead.
One more item that you mentioned about that social sciences can only do something about in the area of ethics. You mentioned Dr. Frank Lewis.
No, he was mostly arguing, and that paper has its own historical context, but he was mostly saying the scientific method would largely be the scientific method as it is in the academic disciplines, and you can only change things from a religious perspective, or in terms of how do you apply those results of that process of knowledge, or so around the ethics of how knowledge should operate once you've applied the scientific method. So I was just saying there's different kind of thinkers of Baha'i scholars, and I identify that position as the kind of minimalist position of and then you get more and more broader positions which ascertain that more can be done. So but kind of also saying that there are limitations and limits when it comes to interactions with social science and science. And I think that's obvious when you think of science, for example, natural science in particular.
I have immense respect for Dr. Frank Lewis. He was such a brilliant, young, kind, educated person. I met him several times. And Baha'i scholarship really lost a gem when he passed. Also, I agree with that there are ideas and scholarships that emphasize the role of empirical approach to knowledge or to science as somehow with greater impact in different disciplines. However, I just share my own response to this, and this doesn't mean that I cannot dialogue or agree with some of their ideas and principles. My personal understanding of this is that the realm of religion, ethics, and philosophy, that if you remember in the previous discussion, the first domain, that domain, I think, when mixed with scientific, with empirical evidence and data, and results in the process or culminates in the process of education, comes into the realm of social discourse, social theory, governance, law, peace, collective security, and all that. So there is this the way that how these issues impact each other. So my primary approach that is coming from my religious background and philosophical background to a large extent is that the priority, the initial force comes from the domain of values, meanings, and that area. That creates impulse for the rest, and this is like a kind of process of continuously changing and growing and all that. And I also mentioned that I'm extremely, in that diagram that last time we discussed, I said that I'm extremely against the idea that in some theological theocracies, they come and say that we have to formulate what social scientists think. Even in secular communist regimes, that was the case. They wanted to impose principles of social materialism or reality. I forgot the terminology. Anyway, to social scientists, to literature, to people who wrote stories. Dr. Boris Pasternak was condemned, but Maxim Gorky was elevated because he liked the revolution and wrote in favor of revolution. But Pasternak was critical of the revolution. So these are all, I'm absolutely against that, and I think the domains must be respected, the boundaries or the borders. Having said that, I think social religion, philosophy, and the domain of values and ethics have a lot to say to social sciences, have a lot to say to remove a lot of nonsense from social sciences. I'm sorry I'm using this terminology, but I think, again, this is my position. It needs lots of discussion and explanation and all that. But I think there is a degree of what we are seeing in social sciences that I briefly explained last time, that we call as the crisis of social sciences. This is a crisis. And we need to address it through some of the methodologies that we discussed today. Not to disregard the importance of social sciences, not to discard these disciplines, but I think there are essentially some needs for changing, create profound changes in the content and processes of social sciences, making it more relevant to issues of our time, to peace, to world peace, to collective security, to emerging concepts in ethics and psychology, the role of consciousness. All of these need to need profound changes. Just one example. Maybe some people may say this is absolutely not a relevant example, but just came across my mind, and that is before the collapse of the Soviet Union, during the 80s, the field of Sovietology was so popular. People keep writing dissertations about the Soviet system and all that. And the idea that Soviet system may collapse was almost never discussed. I mean, there were some people who also predicted that, but what I'm saying is, in political science, it was so this idea was so imbued with political sciences that that required, in my judgment, something more than the data, something more than the observation of the Soviet system and their leaders, something more disciplinary that put together all the elements together, something to bring ethics and literature and all that has happened to intellectuals during the Soviet era. Bring all of this together to foresee the ultimate end of this system. But that wasn't a part of the picture.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for engaging with all these themes and complex subjects. I think we're going to finish now. But I just wanted to ask and maybe observe first that I mean, in a sense, I see you as somewhat as a curriculum developer, as a curriculum theorist, I should say, and curriculum developer. So an example of someone who works in the field of education, but from a very broad philosophical perspective, because curriculum theory, as most would know, is really the field of philosophy of education with an applied side to it. And to some extent, that has largely been lost in the last few decades. I mean, the field itself has dissipated, and also even the field of philosophy of education itself has been devalued. And that's a different discussion to have. Well, the reason I'm mentioning this is because you basically, a lot of the ideas we have discussed today and in the first session are not all, but some, or a main body of ideas is present in one of your manuscripts, which I think was called Bahá'í Education: A Conceptual Perspective. And I'm wondering, so I'm reminding you, but also I'm telling everyone that there is such a manuscript. So I hope you will make it available, or ideally publish it. And again, I think that would be very important, because although it was written some time ago, it was written in a way that really works as a platform for ideas and engagement now. So it is really useful because it forces you to engage things in a sort of broader vision. So whether one disagrees or agrees, it forces everyone to go through a lot of interrelated big topics and questions, which otherwise you probably wouldn't feel motivated to do. So that was one thing I wanted to mention, because I think it fits, and I think anybody interested in what has just been discussed would be even more interested in seeing this in a written form, in a systematized written form. The other part is I wanted to ask you, to end on a sort of biographical note, about your dissertation with the State University of New York at Buffalo. I mean, do you still remember who you were working with there, or what was the context of the time? Why did you go into curriculum development, which is an unusual kind of topic for a Baha'i scholar, let's say? There's few around, but not many.
No, you see, it's a very interesting story. When I was in Iran, I studied, social sciences, economics, and so on. And then I was, encouraged or decided to come to the United States because my brother was here. And that was exactly at the time that Iranian Revolution was taking shape. So I didn't come as a refugee or anything like that. Actually, I went and took the test. There was an English test for those who wanted to go to study in foreign countries. And I passed that test. So I could come. That was a major barrier that was removed to come to the United States before going to military service, which was compulsory. So that was a interesting situation, and I was honestly kind of indifferent about this. I wanted to come, but at the same time, I also was very interested to see what was happening in Iran. I was deeply involved in both intellectual events in Iran and Baha'i community and so on. So in the middle of all of these, my brother really encouraged me to come here, and I said, okay, then let's go. And then to come to the United States, we needed at that time a visa, student visa. But for a student visa, we needed application approval or admission from a university. So then that he sent me that admission letter or admission form, and I used that. I went to the US Embassy. They agreed and they gave me visa, and I came to the United States and studied. And so in a way, even though this was really a fascinating topic for me, it was the first available graduate studies that my brother could get a fast admission visa, and so I came and started that. That's it. It was just force of nature, chances.
Well, it has served us well.
Thank you.
Well, okay, so thank you again. We're gonna end this here. And yeah, I'm not sure what would be a third session, but we will figure it out. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Likewise, thank you.